Hey, everybody. Welcome to Unwriting the Bible. The Bible is the product of an oral traditional culture, and the point of this podcast is to talk about what it might mean to read it that way. If you're not really sure what that means, let me encourage you to check out a previous episode called A Crash Course on Oral Tradition. That will give you the context that you might need to follow along in these conversations and these interviews that I'm putting together here on oral tradition and the Bible. So make sure you check out the Crash Course on Oral Tradition. It's on YouTube, it's on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, just like these interviews. Today, I got to interview, a good friend. Honestly, this is the guy that introduced me to oral traditions from this book, The Jesus Legend, A Case for the Historical Reliability of the Synoptic Jesus Tradition. When I started my doctoral work, I emailed Dr. Eddy and said, hey, I'm thinking about doing this and approaching oral traditional cultures in light of the Old Testament. Do you think it's a good idea? And he said, yeah. And by the way, here's like a bibliography of like 200, 300 sources, and just launched me off. And then was kind enough to help me navigate the publishing process, wrote the preface to my book. I mean, it's been so fun to get to know him over the course of these years. And really, this year we got to hang out some, and he's just a dear friend. And if you don't know who Paul R. Eddy is, he's a professor of biblical and theological studies at Bethel University in St. Paul, Minnesota. He also pastors part-time at Woodland Hills Church. He's authored and co-authored or co-edited a dozen books, including Understanding Transgender Identities, 4 Views. Has just done a lot. He's doing a lot right now with the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender. Has a book coming out on the topic soon. And so, I hope you really enjoy this conversation as we talk about oral traditional cultures and what they mean about the Bible, especially as it relates to the historical reliability of the Jesus tradition. So I hope you enjoy. Hey, welcome to Unwriting the Bible, Dr. Eddy.
Thank you. So good to be with you, Nick.
Super excited to have you. You are the guy for me. You introduced me to this, and I mean, goodness gracious. I mean, if this was set up like the Jedi Council, I would definitely be your Padawan, and so it's really fun to have you on here and to talk.
Well, it's an honor.
So, just in case somebody listening doesn't know you, if there's any like fun fact or anything else you want people to know about you, and then I'd love to hear how you came into contact with this whole, and the field is huge, but how you came into contact with this conversation about this fairly new perspective on orality and how it interacts with the text of the Bible. Yeah.
Again, great to be with you, Nick. Really excited for this conversation. Thankful for this podcast. I'm going to be letting people know about this because not a lot of sort of entry-level places for folks in my church, say, or whatever. So, thanks again. Fun fact, I don't know that I'm that fun of a guy. So there was a distant Eddy several generations ago that got hung for horse stealing. Uh-huh. There you go. It was a fun fact. But what else? Well, you and I were just talking a minute ago. In some sense, it's sort of a fun fact that I even got into this field because I have no business in this field. I'm trained as a philosophical theologian. Not much background in biblical languages. But here I am. I spent some years in here, and I've now found myself magically transported to the world of theology of sexuality over the last 10 years. Yeah. But there was about 15 years there where this area of orality really gripped me. And I'm glad that the book that came out, one of the books that came out of that was Jesus Legend, that inspired you, and that led us to this conversation. So how I got into it, like I said, I was doing my PhD work at Marquette University in Milwaukee. I was there in the Philosophical Theology wing of the school. My dissertation topic had nothing to do with this. I was doing a look at religious pluralism, religious diversity, in dialogue with John Hick, who's just passed away a few years ago, but a very well-known British philosopher of religion. So, but to graduate from this program, I had to take a Gospels course. And it was my first year and my first semester in the first year. And so I take this course on the Gospels, and in the course, something happened to me, man. I got bit by the historical Jesus bug really badly. My professor, a wonderful gentleman, but happened to be a very central figure at that time. This was early 90s, in the Jesus Seminar. And so, of course, very progressive liberal group, kind of deconstructing a lot of the Gospels. And he was at the forefront of this, along with Bob Funk. And so, obviously, in this course, I'm getting challenged as an evangelical student coming to this. And he kind of starts with Rudolf Bultmann as sort of the presupposition of his class. Bultmann to me, back from my days, was the punchline to a joke, not someone which shows how much I had to learn at this level. But anyway, that course, I continued my dissertation with the philosophical theology stuff, but this course so influenced me, I actually, for about 3 weeks, wondered, should I dump philosophical theology, actually learn the biblical languages, and do a dissertation on historical Jesus gospel stuff, because I was so enthralled by it. I didn't do that, but I did, once the dissertation was done, completely shift my scholarly attention to gospels research, historical Jesus stuff for the next 10 or 15 years. And that's when, the actual story is that my very good friend, co-pastor and fellow co-author of a number of works, Greg Boyd, he was starting to do a lot of public debates with a gentleman named Robert Price, who was also a Jesus Seminar member, notoriously so. He's the one, if I remember right, he's the only Jesus Seminar member who held that Jesus never existed, that it was pure fabrication, so the Christ myth theory. And so Greg, this evangelical friend of mine and scholar, and he were debating around the country. And the last debate they did was in 2003 at UCLA. And so Greg and I decided to go with Greg, and we flew down, and the debate happened in UCLA's, some auditorium there. And it went really well in the sense that we got a lot of really good feedback about Greg's presentation from unexpected folks, people who said, well, I'm an atheist, but this was a really interesting thing. I need to look more into Jesus. So on the flight home, we said, what if we did a book together that sort of captured your sort of response to Price? And so we did. And 4 years later, 2007, the Jesus Legend was published, and that was that book. But what we thought about on that plane ride, and what happened 4 years later with the publication, the gap that we did not see on that plane ride was, as I was researching for this book, I fell into the world of orality that I did not know existed.
Yeah.
And what was supposed to be a 2-year project turned into a 4-year project, simply because I just felt we had to immerse ourselves in this orality literature, because it changed everything for so much of our work. So that's how I came into this whole world of orality. And
if I can say real quick, that
that translated for me when I was reading your book. When I hit that, I mean, I remember generally the whole book. What the point of it's in the subtitle, right? A case for the historical reliability of the synoptic Jesus tradition.
Yes.
But that the places where y'all talked about how oral traditions generally work, as opposed to Bultmann, and for me in the Old Testament world, Gunkel, even though there's some differences in how they what they do, but that's what hit me was this changes everything. Like, I mean, if this is the culture that produced the Bible, then this changes how we need to. It changes what the Bible is. It changes how we read it. It changes the purpose and the meaning of it. I mean, not doesn't flip it on its head, but it changes it enough that we need to rethink how we come to it. So that
well said.
That how it impacted you came out. Well, at least for me, it came out of it changes things.
Yeah. And I got so fascinated with the oral tradition piece of that book that for the next number of years, I just kind of, I still did some historical Jesus stuff broadly, but my thing, it's like, I gotta keep going with this orality stuff. It just, I couldn't stop reading about it. My good friend and colleague at Bethel, co-author James Beilby, says that during those years, he said, I spent more time learning about Polynesian oral tradition than any person alive should do that as a theologian. So he was always nagging me, get on to something else. It's like I just couldn't,
Yeah.
And but it was, I think, because of that, I got a chance then to write the oral tradition entry for the new edition that came out in, I think, 2013 of IVP Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels. So that kept me engaged, kind of what's going on, and then this other essay in the 2019 volume. There's always something that I got asked to do that kept me in that field, and I'm really glad, because about 10, 12 years, it ended up permeating not just these things I wrote, but my work as a pastor, my work as a professor at Bethel University. It came out in my classes in really interesting ways that I wouldn't have imagined, but just in conversation about different issues. So yeah, it's been really important.
It's remarkable to me that it is such a under-communicated, like unknown conversation to the most important collection of performances in the world. It's just fascinating to me that the conversation is not out there. I mean, when I came in for my doctoral work, I emailed you, and I didn't think you would answer, because for me you're this ivory tower like superhuman computer mind, and I was like, well, but when you replied back to me, I said, I think this oral traditional stuff has something to it, and I want to look at it in terms of the Old Testament. Is this a good idea? And you said yes, and then you said, and here's a bibliography of like 300 sources, that's I understand from listening to Greg and Preston Sprinkle's interview of you and talking to you about how you research on the research you're doing on sexualities. You kind of when you dig in, like you dig in like a tick, and you just go all in for all the sources and all the which is super awesome.
It's a paranoid obsession of mine. Yeah.
Well, it's a blessing. It's a blessing to us. So it's a blessing to the church. But I came in to my doctoral study with your bibliography, with your blessing, and I tried to be a little obnoxious with how much I pushed this oral traditional thing, because I wanted somebody, to step up and say, "Oh no, Nick, someone's already tried that. Here's the proof that it's wrong." Because I was just certain, the imposter syndrome was really strong with me. I just was certain that somebody would pull the rug out from underneath me. But nobody knew the conversation.
Yes.
But nobody said it was. Well, nobody knew the conversation to even know if it was right or wrong. And it's just crazy. I mean, why do you think that such an? I mean, whether you're going to buy into it or not, even the conversation is not known.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. Why do you think that is?
That is such an important and surprising point, right? And I've thought about that myself. Why is it that, for example, at least and most of my work here, has been in the area of Gospels, Jesus tradition. So you know this much better, or whatever, on the Hebrew Bible side, but it surprises me that, as far as I'm aware, the first serious book in gospel studies to engage this question was Werner Kelber's 1983 book, The Oral and the Written Gospel. And that's like over 2 decades after Lord published his Singer book. How is it possible that almost a quarter of a century went by before Gospels scholars even knew that this was something that significantly impacted the presuppositions of their field?
Yeah.
You start wondering. I mean, one is, it just, there's lots to read, and no one can be a Renaissance person anymore. I think that's part of it. But there's also, I think, 2 other things. Disciplinary presuppositions, and Bultmann and his progeny so powerfully shaped gospel studies. I think that this is true for any field of study. I think there just starts to become sort of normative default settings of, well, we know this, and anything that significantly could undermine that, just as human beings, we sort of don't like that. No one likes revolutions, unless they're the revolutionary. Right. But so I think there's that. But then add to that, probably the biggest thing, I think, is like when you and I are talking about this today, and I was thinking about talking about this again, I just realized all over again, I live in such a highly literate world that I have to remind myself about the things I learned about orality, because they slip away so easily and quickly, right?
Yeah.
And we just live in a different world.
Yeah.
And that's humbling that we can forget what we've learned, let alone how do you learn it in the first place if you're not in circles where this is being talked about. So it's a mysterious issue to me. Yeah.
Yeah. So you stumbled upon it when you were looking at basically arguments for the historicity of the early Jesus tradition.
Yes.
Right? And because the historical Jesus, which quest are we on now? Are we on a quest? Or are we
well, everyone will at least agree we're somewhere in the third quest. Okay. But a couple of people proposing we've actually crossed a boundary into the fourth quest. There's debate on that. So yeah. Okay.
So we've requested a few times anyway. So that's what was the train? So for me, I came in through the Jesus legend, and I was like, oh my goodness, I need to check out this Havelock stuff. This who is it? Honko, is that how you say it?
Laurie Honko, yep.
Laurie Honko,
yeah.
And which led me to Ong, and I was like, oh, and then I discovered Niditch, and I was like, oh, I got to check out this Foley guy, So I had these different exits.
Yes.
What was your your pathway?
Okay, let me try to reconstruct this. So I remember we decided to write this book in the flight back in April of 2003, and I don't know why, but I have this distinct memory that 2 months later, in June, Greg and I happened to go to Ireland for this conference. And I remember sitting in this little bread and breakfast with a copy of Bultmann, because I was starting to work on the oral tradition side of things. And all I knew was, well, there's Bultmann, and then there's conservative reactions against Bultmann, right? And
because that's always been a part of the historical Jesus, right?
Oh yes, absolutely.
That gap between Jesus teaching and doing what he did, and when Mark originally put pen to paper, and we all know that Matthew was the first gospel anyway, not Mark. But anyway, Just kidding. But so there's always been this gap of discussion
yes.
of oral. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you were looking into that.
Looking into that, and I knew from my professor at Marquette, Bultmann's the one I have to wrestle with, and I think it was literally just in Googling some stuff around Bultmann and oral tradition that I ended up being directed to Werner Kelber's book, The Oral and the Written Gospel, and I started reading that, and oh my goodness! On one hand, he shares with Bultmann what I'll probably, as we go along, I'll refer to these two categories, and they're only a heuristic, but sort of what I call the optimistic trajectory of reliability and the pessimistic trajectory. And Kelber clearly shares with Bultmann kind of a pessimism towards reliability of either the oral or the written Gospels with regard to historicity, but in a very different way than Bultmann did. He's talking about these names I've never heard of, right? Havelock and Jack Goody and Perry and Lord, and particularly for Kelber, Ong was a leading light. So I'm going, how have I never heard of these people in seminary or even in my PhD Gospels class? These names weren't coming up.
Right.
And so I had to start looking, and you pull any one of those threads, and all of a sudden, how is this conversation taking place interdisciplinarily all over, and none of the people who are teaching me about the Gospels are interacting with this? And I think much probably for who enters this world doesn't have this moment when they run into John Miles Foley, right?
Yes, right.
And oh my goodness.
Right.
And
gosh, what a brilliant guy.
Yeah. And so I think it was really when I started reading his stuff that then I knew that this is not going to be, I have to bring this into Jesus Legend to mention it. This reframed 4 of the main chapters of the book. When I was introduced to Foley. Yeah. That's
all. I think that I don't remember how I got to it. You know what I think happened? My supervisor, Dr. Rick Johnson, as much as he didn't know of this conversation, it was so funny. I mean, during my dissertation defense, he said, at one point he said, "Oh, so you're saying that multiform performances of the tradition can exist side by side at the same time?" Something like that. And I was like, "Yes, Dr. Johnson. We've been working on this for a while." But it's such a new paradigm.
That's such a classic example, right? He had already read every chapter of your dissertation, no doubt.
Yes.
But that coin dropping in the slot, right? That's. I think we keep having those experiences, don't we, in this field?
Yes.
As soon as I leave this conversation, go out that door today, it's like I'll be back in the literate world that tells me that stuff's not true.
100%. Yeah. 100%. Well, he mentioned a book that was it was like empirical models challenging biblical criticism, which is actually it's more of a more of a textual, just a normal Western modern. It's like we've been studying source criticism, we've been studying form criticism. Here's why our studies are saying that this may not these models may not work. But then he also suggested this one, or maybe I just discovered it when I was buying this one on Amazon. But this contextualizing Israel's sacred writings is
who's the author on that?
Phenomenal. It's edited by Brian B. Schmidt.
Okay.
But it's got articles. I mean, you can see this is how I read my books. My tabs are just little markings on the spine or on the. But I mean, it's got articles by David Carr, and he mentions Susan Niditch.
Okay.
It's got articles by. And there's a lot of background information about the archaeological evidence for writing in the early Levant. So Robert D. Miller, who's great with performance stuff.
Yes.
Then Raymond Person Jr.
Okay.
Who's just amazing. I mean, he's amazing. You would love his stuff. His latest work is on conversational analysis.
Oh.
And how conversation analysis can help us process through variations we find in like textual criticism, because you're basically looking at a performance model.
Okay.
And so he's pretty great. But everybody kept mentioning Susan Neidich and this article from Coley from Oral Traditions Journal, the Oral Tradition journal that Foley started.
Yep.
And so that was, I launched into Neidich. I read that article. Then I was like, oh my gosh, I got to figure out this Foley guy because of what Neidich said. And so that was when everything unraveled for me. And
Yep. All roads eventually lead to Foley, though, don't they? This one way or
yes, to Foley and from Foley, man.
And from Foley, yeah.
So in your field, you dive into this and it unravels. You're like, oh my goodness, oral traditional cultures, and really kind of I think what you and I agree on now is it's not just the oral part of it. It's more of the traditional part of it. That this is a culture that shares a tradition of identity, a tradition of, just communication, how they understand themselves and communicate their identity, including their historical stories and their rituals, and all of that is just the tradition side of things, which is very different than the Western post-Renaissance, post-industrial scientific revolution, post-Gutenberg culture that we grew up in, which is very pluralistic, and we don't share the same kind of traditional context.
Absolutely.
And so all this unravels for you. You're like, oh my goodness, this is the kind of culture that produced the Bible and the Gospels. Walk us through, what were the implications? How did it change the way that you were engaging this conversation of the historical Jesus?
Yeah. Let me set that up, and really this will set up probably a number of things I'd say today, because you'd mentioned this different way of thinking about and acting communication, right? That we sort of orality opens us up to. And I don't know if you found this, Nick, but in trying to teach and explain this world, I have found that one of the challenges is that in the field, the word oral is performing double or sometimes triple duty, and when a word is used equivocally, it isn't always helpful, right? And so I think again, any class I'm in, trying to help my students remember that when you hear the word oral in this conversation, you got to stop for a moment and say, wait a minute, is that person, or am I thinking about this in terms of the medium, like oral versus written? Or are we actually talking about, and here's why I wish we could find a better word than oral, because now there's not just the medium issue, but the register issue that can, the way of communicating, because it's weird to say that this written text is functioning orally, right? Like that, it's mixing.
Yes.
But that is the language we have today, and so oral register, right? And that's the piece that I think, when I can see that bifurcation, then to start thinking, okay, an oral way of communicating can travel between oral and written contexts, and that there's a real kind of spectrum here. Foley was so helpful, the different types and ways orality can interact with writing, all of it being in an oral register, right? So that I think was a real breakthrough for me, and has influenced, I think, the way I'd answer your question to what are the ways this played out, say, in historical Jesus research, and just more broadly, I think, in my work as a a biblical and theological studies person, I would say the main areas that I see where I have benefited, my students have benefited, I hope the Jesus legend for most of these, would be, I think, in 5 or 6 interesting ways where orality makes a difference. One would be, and this is more sort of, I guess, foundational stuff, but some of the cross-cultural comparative projects, like what we can learn about reading scripture, let's say, by learning about contemporary, highly illiterate oral cultures, right? So it's cross-cultural comparative stuff, I think, is a really interesting sub-area that I trust will continue to develop. Then there's, really the field you've contributed to with your book, Exegeting Orality, the sort of moving to, what are the exegetical implications of this whole thing? I love Boomershine's phrase, media eisegesis, that you can do all this great exegetical work and miss the fact that you're eisegeting things just because you don't know about, right? Oral register and these sorts of things.
Right.
And that's where I think Cascade's series that you're part of, your book's part of, has really been helpful for performance criticism, these sorts of things. Moving more to specifics in the Jesus legend, I would say some of the main areas where this impacted the book and my thinking to this day. One would be implications of an oral culture for text criticism, right? Like in my environment, coming out of the evangelical background, it was sort of, there's someone like Bart Ehrman who sees differences in the manuscript tradition as corruptions. And there's we more conservative folks who want to explain those away so there's no corruption because we want a stable text, right? So there's
we have Metzger says we have 98.6% confidence. Yes.
Yeah. And Norm Geisler says, look at that scroll of Isaiah from Qumran. Only 17 differences, and none of them matter to theology. These sorts of things, right?
Yeah.
And I think the major change up for my thinking about this was an article I was reading by Doan, I think was his name, a scholar, who said, what if scribes in an oral culture were also performers?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And what they're doing is they're sort of, it's a frozen performance, but that performance is one of the multiforms of this tradition, right?
Yes.
And
when they were writing it, like they knew this is being written for the purpose of being read out loud, for being performed.
Yes.
And David Carr, and I don't remember which book it was, but he talks about how there was one scroll of the 12 prophets that doesn't even write every word, but it writes the first word of every verse and then the first letter of the next word. So when you're talking about, when you're in a culture, a traditional culture, an oral traditional culture, like what does literacy mean?
Yes.
Literacy doesn't mean I can read proper grammar and translate it. Literacy, in that case, literacy means I already know the entire 12 minor prophets, and to perform it out loud, all I need is the first word in the consecutive letters.
Yes.
And I'm literate to read that text. Like it's really crazy how it's the paradigm shift to think in these terms of a totally different culture. There's multiple shifts that have to happen.
Yes. And I love what you said. It should remind us that any ancient text, at least any ancient text within an orally dominant culture, and which culture wasn't, right? Back in the ancient world, every written text emerges out of and sort of stands, in a sense, as a frozen performance of, only to be merging back into that wider performative tradition that's dominantly oral. So the verbal parameters, I guess, so to speak, of any person writing a text, it just changes everything when I think about how I, as an evangelical scholar, want to think about wrestling with textual criticism and the challenges that poses. When I think about that an author, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, these authors of these Gospels are probably in their head thinking, I want this to be faithful. But what does faithful mean? It means faithful to the various, the performance parameters of what was already read aloud and heard of this gospel tradition for years now, right? And it has to be faithful to that. But boy, that's not how I thought about faithful scribal activity in an apologetics class in my seminary, right?
Oh, sure. I mean, because we have people come in, and I don't remember. It's been a long time since I've read the Jesus Legend, but some things stick with me, and I don't know if this was an example that you used, but people come in and they say, look at the discrepancies.
Yeah.
And they call it a discrepancy because it's different, but different means something different to an oral traditional culture. So when Jesus sends out the 12 or the 72 or 73, or depending on what manuscript tradition you're looking at, whatever, but did he tell them? There are some discrepancies between the synoptic gospels, right? Like, don't take any money, or only take one money pouch, or take one cloak or two cloaks, or no walking stick, or just only a walking stick. Like, I don't remember the exact discrepancies, but we come to this and we look at these things and we say, look, they can't even get this right.
Yes.
How do we know anything they said about Jesus was true? When in that oral traditional cultures, it was like those details only matter in as much as they help us understand the truth about what Jesus actually did teach and who he was, and the core of what he actually did and said.
Yes.
And it's so funny how we'll get good arguments for how Matthew, Mark, and Luke can use the same traditional material and misquote each other, but then when we go to textual criticism, we're like, oh, no, we have to find the autograph.
Yes.
Like we have to compare all these variations and find the autograph, because no matter what, however these oral traditional bearers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, however they did things, the other scribes, they had to get everything right or it was a mistake.
Right.
And that's that was, I remember reading that was one of those coin dropping in the slot moments for me when you said in the book something like, that's exactly what we get with Matthew, Mark, and the Synoptic Gospels, is people telling the same meta-narrative with a different emphasis, using small stories, rearranged, reworded for the purpose that they're getting at. And then I was like, oh my goodness, well, that's exactly also what we have in Genesis through 2 Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles.
Okay.
Now 1st Chronicles tells a lot of the story through genealogy, but if you start telling a genealogy in a traditional culture, Adam begot Seth, Seth begot, like, they're hearing the story as they're tracking along with the characters. And so you have the same stories told in different ways for different purposes, rearranged, different numbers of chariots in the battles, because did Jesus say take a stick or no stick, or there are 10,000 chariots or 20,000 chariots? But you're missing the point of how the traditional cultures actually work and what they're trying to communicate in the text. And it just changes everything.
It does. You alluded to I think another area that got played out, and so if I was to be asked, what would you change in Jesus' legend if you could change anything? My answer would instantly be, I'd revisit that section on ancient literacy. I think, and
that data is changing all the time. I mean, people are coming up with new theories and new archaeological discoveries of ancient literacy. I'm sorry, but you would change that.
So I think, and Keith pointed this out he responded to Jesus Legend at one point in his book on where he dealt with literacy rates and things. Mm-hmm. And he called us out, and he should have, because I think what you have in that section is, in the same chapter, you've got us talking about ancient literacy, trying to defend a robust literacy rate for ancient Judaism. Mm-hmm. And then it moves into orality, where, right. And to your point, we can debate, and there probably will be ongoing debates about what are the literacy rates in particular pockets of the ancient Mediterranean world. Mm-hmm. But even if you have a high literacy rate, and this is what I didn't see at that time, I just didn't put it together. Even if you had a high literacy rate, now we're saying, in this sense, medium, right? Written abilities, as opposed to just oral. That doesn't change, or at least doesn't necessarily change, the fact that an oral dynamic or register is still at work within those texts. And I hadn't quite put that together as clearly as I needed to. So on one hand, I wanted to argue with, say, John Meyer in his big historical Jesus project. He kind of says, well, there probably was a higher literacy rate among ancient Jews than the average populace of the Mediterranean world, just because they put such a strong emphasis on their sacred scriptures. Mm-hmm. It's like, I would like that to be true. So I argued that case, right? And that means you're going to come against William Harris in his sort of, 3 to 15% across the board. And I suspect I was operating out of what I hoped was the case, rather than just really wrestling with the straight data on one hand, and now also realizing I didn't need to argue for for what I really wanted to get at, which is tradition has a conserving impulse, whether it's in written form or oral form. And but literacy rate debate, of course, comes into this whole question. So that's another area I think that we end up, certainly I was made aware of. Here's another one, honestly, and this one mystifies me. Implications of orality studies for the notorious synoptic problem, right? Like, how are the Gospels related? Yeah. And it's still the case, as far as I can tell, that the two-source theory is like far and away the dominant mode that both Luke and Matthew copy from, in some very robust sense, copy from Mark and this additional Q source. Mm-hmm. And yet, when Albert Lord and John Foley independently, like I think there were maybe two different issues of Oral Tradition Journal articles where they intersect with the Bible, both of them, experts in oral traditions, say they see nothing in the Synoptic Gospels that cannot be fully accounted for by largely independent written variations of a shared pool of traditional material. Yeah. And so you don't need, they say, these intricate copying sort of things. And I remember it was just after Jesus Legend was published. I was at a ETS conference in San Diego in a packed room, pretty good-sized room, for a section on Synoptic Gospels. And there was a panel up there talking about some of the Synoptic problem came up. And so I just raised my hand, and the guy picked me. I said, quick question. When Albert Lord and John Miles Foley, indisputably two of the 20th century's greatest oral tradition scholars, say that they see nothing in the synoptics that can't be explained by independent use of oral tradition, I said, what does that do? Or what should that do to us as gospel scholars in terms of maybe slowing our row on this, we've got this figured out? And I kid you not, to a T, every panel member who weighed in who said, come on, just look at the Synoptic Gospels. clearly they couldn't have been independent sources drawing from. It's like, wait a minute, people who are experts in that field say it's clear that it can be. So, but there's just, we just don't talk about this. So that's ironic, to say the least.
It is totally ironic, and it's just to the point we were talking about earlier, is why this doesn't get more of an ear in scholarship. Is like we just know the trajectory that we're supposed to be chasing after.
Yes.
And so, I mean,
we know what we know.
Yeah, I don't want. This is a horrible metaphor, but I'm going to use it anyway. Like when the Pharisees clogged their ears and just charged at Stephen. Maybe a little harsh of a connection there, but it's we just plow through.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's Ehrman. I read your article last night just to make sure I was refreshed on it. It'd be fun to go through those 4 points too of why the optimistic perspective is so powerful. But people just like, I was listening when I was preparing for my dissertation. I was just Googling, trying to find anything, and I was on YouTube, and there was at a university here in California, this guy said they were having a conference on the documentary hypothesis. And they were like, people say the documentary hypothesis is outdated, but we know it's not, and they want to talk about this oral traditional stuff. And we've all played the telephone game. We know how that works. I whisper it to you, and you whisper it to you, and you whisper it to you. And by the time it gets over there, it's a totally different. And Bart Ehrman compares oral tradition to the same kind of thing. And it's just like hardly. It's amazing that scholars who have seen their field be so misunderstood, won't take the time to go say, well, what are these people who are spending all their time in this field? What are they saying? Actually happens here. It's really funny. We plug up our ears and just charge down what we think we're going to prove or we're going to find. It's really interesting.
It is. It reminds me, honestly, of Thomas Kuhn's book. 59 maybe he wrote this, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, applying to science, but I think it applies to all areas of knowledge, that any field, any discipline, starts to build up what it senses to be a foundational database of knowledge for its field to work from. And that becomes the mainstream, quote-unquote, science of that field. And it's an inertia that is almost impossible to overcome, according to Kuhn, until younger scholars have a revolution. And it's not like the older scholars go, oh, we were wrong. They just kind of have to die out.
That sounds so bad, but it happens in churches too, right?
Doesn't it? Everywhere.
We can remove the organ. Condition. We just need a few funerals first.
But you and I, we're those younger scholars.
Doesn't it feel good to be right? Only people can be right like me.
It's the human condition. It is.
Yeah, sure. And then this is kind of in line of things that how your studies in oral traditional studies affected how you're approaching the historicity of the synoptic tradition and the Jesus quest. And in your article, you talk about this pessimistic approach that often comes and says, yes, there's in these traditional cultures, there is some consistency, and there is flexibility.
Yep.
But the flexibility is so much that we can't really trust the facts behind it, the historicity behind it.
Yes.
And that's where you put Kelber and others in that side of things, and then the optimistic view that says, well, there's flexibility and there's stability, and the stability is such that we can learn. Actually, the flexibility is a great exegetical tool to see why did they flex there within this stable. But the stable part is enough that we can trust the foundational historical roots of what's being said.
Yes. Yes.
So do you want to tease that out?
Sure.
Tease that out for us?
And honestly, that's kind of the last area that I would say, and just because obviously so, was how oral traditional studies led me to rethink of how I think about the historical reliability of the Jesus tradition. And so that you've opened the door for that conversation. Yeah. You captured exactly where to start that, because at least scholars who are up to speed on something around this conversation today find agreement. Like you can actually find consensus that there is both stability and flexibility. There's both fixity in some sense and variation. The debate now becomes, how do we think about the nature and so-called balance of that in an oral traditional culture? And I think to really wrestle with the implications of orality for the gospel tradition, my sense is that we're going to know we're in the right ballpark if the people who tend to be in biblical studies tend to be on the progressive liberal side of things that want a lot of flexibility are going to find that they're challenged by there being maybe a little more stability than they're comfortable with. While at the same time, the conservatives are going to be challenged by there being facing the fact there's more variation and flexibility than they wish was there. And if you feel yourself uncomfortable on both sides, you're probably somewhere in the right ballpark. That's kind of how it's cashed out to me.
And so just to clarify that a little bit is to be uncomfortable on both sides. It's like in the Old Testament world, monotheism. The more progressive, quote unquote, liberal side will say monotheism was an invention of the 8th century prophets to help solidify the country in this crazy crisis of the threat of Assyria, Babylon, and exile. And so that's there's a huge stream of scholarship that holds fast to that. They've published on that, and that's their shtick. Well, by and large, for the most part, traditional cultures don't rewrite their traditional material and change who they've always been to make sense of the present. They actually make sense. They interpret the present in light of who they've been. And so that whole side of things is going to have to shift and say, we're not comfortable with the level of stability that has actually been shown in field work and in studies of ancient traditional cultures. Of current field work in current traditional cultures and in ancient. And then our wonderful, wonderful brothers and sisters in Christ, even though they write really bad reviews of our books on Amazon, who hold to a verbal plenary inspiration of the Bible and say that God, when the final version of the Bible was written, edited together, the Holy Spirit inspired a person almost in a possession type way to write down letter by letter, word for word, exactly these holy scriptures, that any variation from that is a mistake, that we need to go back and find a way to correct it. Instead of oral traditional cultures are comfortable with flexibility, so that maybe even the Septuagint is as authoritative as the Masoretic tradition. So that when we come to the New Testament and we see Paul quote Habakkuk chapter 2, or not Paul, but someone quote Habakkuk chapter 2 in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 37 and 38, and it's different than both the Septuagint and the Masoretic tradition, with a little bit of Isaiah thrown in. But it's actually blending them anyway. That there's this flexibility that this is true to the tradition, even in its variation. And we kind of lose a little bit of control when it's not as stable as we think it's supposed to be from our post-Gutenberg. So and that's this discomfort on both sides. And so that's what you were talking about is that if you're uncomfortable on both sides, you might be onto what is actually found in these traditional cultures.
Yes. And it might be that the reason there has to be uncomfortability on both sides of this current, quote unquote liberal conservative debate on reliability. Mm-hmm. What I use in that essay, and I think it's a helpful little phrase, Zeba Crook coined it, the reliability wars, because that's kind of what it is, right? This back and forth. But what's true about all members engaged in the reliability war these days is all of us are highly literate post-Gutenberg people, right?
Right.
And so the more progressive folks tend to think about flexibility in the way that flexibility works in literate cultures, where you can be detached from any tradition. In fact, that's novelty and creativity, and that's a good. And the conservatives tend to think of fixity in terms of literate fixity and high-level precision standards and all the things that make sense in a literate culture. That's media eisegesis. That's just not the world. And so it's understandable why this polarization happens, but it's fascinating that this is happening amongst scholars, and I would include pastors, for whom we would all say, wouldn't we, scholars and pastors, that one of our main services that we offer to students or the church is to know about and do the heavy lifting on things like historical context, cultural context, literary context, but somehow we don't put on that list media context. Mm-hmm. And so we're very careful about getting the historical context right, missing a very important part of that historical context, which was orality. And so it's a gap that really influences things in harmful ways when we don't bring this orality piece into the conversation of exegesis.
Yeah.
Love the title of your book, man, or Exegeting Orality. You nailed it.
I do too. I really, I was really happy with the title. Yeah, man. And it's what's funny is every single pastor I've ever listened to practices activation in their sermons.
Yes.
They're going to say words and phrases intentionally to position people's minds and hearts right where they want them to hear the word. Down to the classic example of saying, "Hey, don't forget the Lord is my shepherd," which communicates so much more than those words. It activates the tradition in our mind. But it's like this cognitive dissonance, right? Is that the right way to say it? That we perform that way, we communicate that way, even in our own little traditions.
Yes. But
we don't go to the Bible to realize, man, the word Christ, which is Messiah, that one word has a string of activation, a string of tradition that, we won't name names, but a pastor that said, basically said maybe we can leave the Old Testament behind and just focus on Jesus in the New Testament. Like, Yeshua, Mashiach, has no depth of identity outside of the incredible tradition behind it all. Mm-hmm. And so that we communicate that way in our little tradition and don't come to the text and say, man, this is representative of a huge tradition that people were saturated in. We've got to let the citations and the illusions of this traditional material launch us back into the tradition, saturate ourselves in that part of the tradition before we can understand what they're actually even saying.
Exactly. Yeah.
So this optimistic view. Why should we emphasize the stability to the point to where we say we can be sure that Jesus existed. We can be sure that he taught these kinds of things, that he died on the cross and rose 3 days later. Like, why is this stability stable enough for us to have confidence in the historicity of the Jesus tradition?
Yeah, great question. And the focus of a lot of my work in this area has been trying to answer that question. And very early on, I realized that if I'm going to take the deliverances of orality seriously for this kind of reliability question, I'm going to have to start nuancing language in ways I wouldn't have and didn't prior to my understanding of orality. And so Greg and I, for example, in Jesus Legend, started talking about using phrases like the general reliability. We used the word gist a lot, right? Began to realize that what we had been trained to do as evangelical scholars was to search for ways of demonstrating with a very high precision standard the reliability of what I now know to be orally oriented documents. And so that shift really, we knew in doing that, we were going to probably upset some conservative folks.
Yeah.
What do you mean just general,
Right.
It's like, well, let me introduce you to the world of orality,
Yes,
And,
yes.
So it made our claims more modest, but on the other hand, it also seemed to resonate with, say, the diversity we find in the four Gospels. And you've said this several times today. What would appear to be problems or corruptions from sort of a highly literate perspective actually become gifts and windows, diversified windows into the wider pool of tradition that out of which these four frozen performances emerged and into which they eventually flowed back into. And it's once you see the benefits and gifts of orality, yes, there's going to be some uncomfortableness as our highly literate selves get used to this way of thinking, but it also makes so much sense of what we actually find in the text.
Right.
So that became something we tried to help our readers adjust to. So now I think about the general historical reliability, meaning, and so you mentioned kind of four areas that I focus on, particularly in this last essay I did for this book. I don't remember the title of it. There we go. Jesus, Skepticism and the Problem of History. There we go. And so I would say kind of two preliminary things, and I actually mentioned these before I get into my four anchor posts, is I think it's important to recognize the importance of genre specificity when we talk about oral tradition, just as we do when we talk about written texts. And, as far as I understand it, Bultmann, for example, in his interaction with oral forms were predominantly from what we might categorize as folklore and entertainment genres. And those are wonderful genres that overlap, but they're not the same. At least traditional cultures don't treat their entertainment genres in the same way they treat, for example, they're ritualistic, they're broadly religious, and they're kind of identity-shaping historical traditions. They treat them differently. We know this. I mean, Ruth Finnegan has documented this from African to Polynesian cultures that largely illiterate oral cultures still have a clear sense of what they would say. She uses the words true stories as opposed to fictional stories, and they treat them differently. And I don't think that doesn't come across in Bultmann. I don't even know if it comes across so much in Kelber. I fear that genre insensitivity has often plagued orality studies. I think this was a problem of Lord Perry. Can't blame Perry. He died too early. But Lord's appropriation and and expression of kind of the Lord Perry thesis was generalizing as oral a rather slender set of Serbo-Croatian tales in coffee shops, right? So I think that's something to be aware of, is different oral genres will have different sensibilities about whether it's important to keep them more rigorously bound to tradition than not. And so the stability, flexibility dynamic comes in per genre. There's also the issue, kind of second qualification, of time span, right? Everyone from J.C. Miller in African Studies, Jan van Sina, African Studies. But I think there's even scholars of Serbo-Croatian studies that have shown that, and this is sort of just logical, that the greater a time span between an event and its oral reporting, the more flexibility you can assume is going to creep into the tradition. And so that's, for example, honestly, Nick, why I've appreciated you stepping in to the realm of the Hebrew Bible here, because we're talking about much greater time spans than between Jesus and the Gospels, right?
Yeah.
And I think that really complexifies things. I'm wondering, how does that, did that ever like figure into your work as an issue to wrestle with? Maybe not. Not in the same way of, say, a gospel scholar trying to demonstrate historicity of Jesus' words to this gospel or something like that.
Oh no, absolutely. You know, I mean, one of the classic examples is, you know, if you look at if you take the chronology of like Abraham and Sarah and Ishmael, that whenever I'm having a brain fart, but Ishmael's mother Hagar. When she puts him on her shoulders and goes out in the wilderness, that he would have been like 16 or something, something obscene like that, you know.
Okay.
And so like just how does the chronology fit in together, and how oral traditional cultures don't focus on chronology as much.
Yes. And
did these many people really meet their wives at a well? You know, is that really? Do they all really do that? And so things like that. And what's really interesting to me is like what Gunkel and form critics of the Old Testament seem to do is they seem to expect they miss this genre by thinking that, you know, there were these legends or epics, maybe at one point connected to some historical person, maybe.
Yeah.
But this story was serving some kind of purpose in the community at some point, right? But at some point, an editor took all of these disconnected stories and like built a tradition out of it that then flowed in some way, and that's why the chronology's off or whatever. You know, oh my goodness, not Robert Alt. Gosh, the traditional historical. Man, my Dr. Johnson would just slap me. But anyway, he would even say that the Exodus tradition was separate from the conquest tradition.
Okay.
And that later on those were put together, and that's why the conquest doesn't always seem to work just right. And so yeah, there's all of these approaches that again are looking back at it through this modern post-scientific, like we want everything to line up. Positivism isn't that the philosophical approach, that we have to have every little thing positively lined up specifically? This positivistic approach, that when things aren't lined up, we assume from our ethnocentristic approach to what we're studying that they had to finagle the data a little bit. Yeah. Instead of, no, there's these true stories that are told without worrying about perfect chronology or perfect detail in every element, because the point isn't to explain what happened, but the point is to describe what it means for us that it happened.
Yes.
But it happened.
Yes.
You know. So yeah, so that's what the Old Testament form critics do. Whereas it seems to me that the New Testament form critics are more, instead of saying they took these old disconnected stories about Jesus and put them together is more like, oh, the church had a need.
Yes.
And so they created a story about Jesus and put that in the tradition.
Yes.
And so kind of a different approach there but both failing to see that traditions don't invent their traditions as they go. So
yes.
That they're always reminded of who they are wherever they are by
Yes.
the tradition that is shared by the whole community. And well, I'm getting into things that you're probably going to talk about, but so yes, that's kind of how I've been processing through it from the Old Testament.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. And yeah, you're right. That sort of the again, the almost unavoidable sort of impulse for both Hebrew Bible and New Testament scholars in this regard is to think about this. You know, Bultmann's whole idea of, like you say, post-Easter community has needs. They have questions. Wouldn't it be nice if Jesus had said something about that?
Yes,
well,
right.
Let's say he did. You know? And like that. That's exactly what a creative, modern, literary novelist would want to do. Is
Yes, that's right.
create characters that say things.
Right.
But boy, that's going to rub up against ancient oral traditional cultures. And so to jump to the kind of the four anchor points that you mentioned, the first one that I usually think about, because I think it sets the stage for understanding the other three, is just turning back to Foley's work and others, but Foley, again, the first place I really saw this was just wrapping your head around, as a post-Gutenberg literate person, what it must have been like for the interplay of tradition and performance, right? And that what he calls traditional referentiality, and for me that's like one of those banner slogans for understanding this field. That to use Foley's language, that each oral performance is what he calls an enabling event for the community to come together. It's going to be in performance moments where some aspect of the tradition is going to be shared together as a communal event. But underlying that, something you and I would not see if we were good anthropologists studying this moment in this culture, what we would miss, but what every one of them assumed as what he calls the enabling referent, is the tradition itself.
Yeah.
And that's what they're soaked in, and that the anthropologists coming in can have no idea about until they learn the tradition. And so this idea that once you're soaked in a tradition, you've mentioned this word activation, such a key idea. A single word, or you even said a letter of a second word in some text, is like hitting a menu button with all of this information that the person ignorant of the tradition has no access to. And getting that piece, I think, pulls back on this sort of modern way of imagining how oral performance went. That you just go into a context, you know some tradition, but you're here to, at least around the campfire at night with your community, you want to keep them entertained. Boring performances, they don't perform that much. And so you just say whatever comes to your mind, you know?
Right.
Or wouldn't it have been helpful if Jesus had said this? And not recognizing that the entire community, in a sense, shows up knowing what you're going to say. They just don't know which parts you're going to say, how you're going to say it, the variations, but we all know the story. We all know the story, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've ran into her, but there's a scholar named Karen Barber. Does that name ring a bell?
No.
So she's got a number of articles, but also this wonderful book out. I think it was published around 2006, 7, somewhere in there. But what she is, she's an anthropologist, but she specialized in African traditions, oral traditions. And she has this long chapter in her book where she challenges modern Western people, to use Foley's language, in taking seriously that stabilizing element of the tradition itself. Mm-hmm. And she says something like this, is I actually have in that essay. It's a really wonderful way of stating it. I'm paraphrasing her, but something to the effect that the tradition and the stability of the tradition is something, she says, is object-like. Right? In other words, in their minds, even though they're illiterate, it's as if it was, I'll use Laurie Honko's phrase here, it's like each member of the illiterate oral community nonetheless has what Honko calls a mental text. Mm-hmm. And it's not verbatim words, but it's the gestalts, it's the gist of the tradition. And she says that stable mental text in each person's mind, her words now, is the condition of the possibility of fluidity in the tradition. Without the stability, you can't have the fluidity.
Right.
And to me, that's an anchor post for turning to some of the impulse of the optimistic trajectory. That that fluidity is the very stability is the very condition for the possibility of making sense of the various fluid variations of any performance.
Right.
And that, I think, should stop up short some of the sort of pessimistic conclusions about oral cultures. They don't have the resources to keep something stable.
Right. I just had an idea of, I think this is a great illustration of this tradition that is stuck in people's head as almost the thing itself, right? And is how Disney now is starting to redo their old cartoons as live action films.
Yes.
And so people get really excited, and we gather into this theater, in which we gathering into a theater that sets a mood. We're in a black box with a screen in front of us. We're not expecting anybody. We're not expecting a marching band. We're not expecting a basketball game in front of us. Like we have a scene that fits our tradition. We know what this is, and we have the script in our head. We know. From beginning to end, we know exactly what's supposed to happen. There are certain key phrases that if those key phrases aren't said, we're going to be super disappointed. If they change a key phrase, we're going to be really mad.
That's a great analogy.
And the Disney, they try to make things kind of new. They make a couple of changes to keep it interesting and keep it fresh.
Yeah.
Maybe to connect to our new social changes that are different than whenever some of those cartoons came out 30, 40, 50 years ago.
Right.
But everybody in there knows what they're supposed to see, and if too much has changed, people get really upset. And it's not like a live performance of a person where we can say, no, that's not right, but we'll sure go to the internet, and we'll say, this is horrible, they screwed it up, they messed it up. Like just a microcosm of
that is I'm going to steal that. I'll footnote in my lectures.
Yeah.
My good friend Nick says that's a great analogy. I love that. Yeah.
But that's just a movie.
Yeah.
This tradition is their whole identity, like to the extent that people would say, the Lord rescued us out of Egypt. Well, no, he didn't. He rescued your great. No, the Lord rescued us out of Egypt. And this is who we are. Yeah. And that whole tradition of all of their identity is like you said, or like Barbara said, a solid reality in their minds that change some things to help us understand what it means for us today.
Yes.
But you can't change the core of it. We'll all get after you about it.
Yeah. Exactly. And so that's sort of first point, understanding how traditional referentiality works and that interplay. Like I think now this can give us some more crystallized ballpark of how the balance of stability and flexibility have to work in order to hold a community together, an oral community. And so the other 3 points just kind of emerge from this gestalt here of that important tension. The first would be that Bultmann and others, some of the standard Bultmannian assumptions, I think, that have just shaped so much of 20th and early 21st century gospel studies have been things like you've mentioned, that if the church had a need, they were very comfortable inventing sayings just to fit their needs. Secondly, Bultmann said this, that he thinks there's no indication that the early church had any interest in the biographical details of Jesus' life. Mm-hmm. And then the third assumption was that because oral tradition in classic form criticism is, as you said, composed in these micro units, right? Like little sayings here, a little narrative here, and then somehow they all get pulled together at some point and fit into a chronological tapestry. But see, that is de novo, right? That's not traditional. It's the little pieces that are traditional. And so the classic argument is that Mark comes along and he's the first person to create a long oral narrative out of all this disparate material. And that was assumed to be the case.
Such a Western individualistic approach.
Yes.
Like this guy's going to invent something.
Yes.
Like it's so crazy. It's so funny.
Well, so it's very Western in that sense. It's also Western in the lack of understanding of the capacity of non-literate people. Like, there's just a sort of primitivism. Like, those simple people couldn't hold on to anything more than a little narrative here or there. No. Turns out, and this is where Laurie Honko's work was really important for me to learn about. So Finnish folklorist who he did his particular field work among the Tulu people in southern India, and he started learning about this epic that they had, this oral epic, the Siri epic, and he finally asked them, some of the tradents who knew this epic, he said, "Would you recite the whole thing for me?" And they're like looking at him like, "What are you talking about? Like, we don't recite the whole thing." But he finally talked them into it. And he said it took them, it was either 6 or 7 days.
It's crazy.
But they could do it.
Yeah.
But they told him, we don't ever do this unless, like, someone like you comes and asks us to.
Because we don't need to.
We don't need to.
Everybody already has it in there. Yeah.
So he, and when he starts documenting his whole book on his transcribing of this epic into written text, and he says it turns out it is almost to the line the same length as the Iliad.
Wow.
You talk about a long oral narrative of illiterate people, right?
Right.
So he said this just, his words here, obliterated and shattered folkloristic understandings of the capacity of oral peoples to have narratives.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that information has, I don't think, transferred to a lot of gospel studies people.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating how to this day a lot of gospel scholars still write as if Bultmann paradigm is correct. And we just know it's not now. And I would now suggest that from very early on, there was, to use Honko's words here, a shared mental text of the life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And it had many performative variations, but it had particular anchor posts, and to use the idea of Disney, and particular phrasing at certain moments that was really important. And that now, if that's true, Mark didn't make anything up in that sense. Mark was simply one performative variation of an oral possibility, an oral pool of narrative material that was already there literally from the beginning. And that, I think, is going to be just naturally cause very different assessments of the possibility of reliability now for the tradition. The final two pieces are the dynamics between
Well, can I interrupt you real quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because that's something that I wanted to point out in the part of my book where I talk about the synoptic tradition of the passion predictions of Jesus.
Yes.
How all three of the synoptic gospels, as much as they differ in this section, they all have these three. I mean, Luke has a few other passion predictions, but they all anchor this central section that is focused on discipleship. What does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus? And it's a long walk with Jesus to the cross. Like it's on the journey toward Jerusalem. Set in these framed by these three passion predictions, which is they change it up a lot for their specific purposes. Especially Luke has a huge gap between, I think, the second and the third one. And Matthew uses his second two, I think, as like a bookend of this great chiastic structure. But that they all use it the same way, like crazy different.
Yes.
But the overall structure very the same. I mean, that's exactly what we're talking about, and may even emphasize the fact that was a really significant time for the disciples as they were walking to Jerusalem with Jesus for the last time, and he structured that journey that after the resurrection they could go back and be like, oh my goodness, did you see what he did for us there? Yeah. And I think was it you in Jesus' Legend that talked about, like, if Peter would have shared, if he would have told the story of Jesus like once a week until he died, that he would have told it, I mean, thousands of times. I forget what it was, but and so if Mark had heard it over and over and over, I mean, but it is not crazy to think that, and especially in the days after Pentecost, when things are just getting going, how many times are they telling that story?
Right.
I mean, at least daily, and so that it would catch a structure, they would build this oral tradition of Jesus from their teaching that Jesus taught them.
Yes.
Not to mention the 40 days after resurrection where Jesus is there, like, hey, here I am. Here's our Old Testament tradition. I fulfilled it. Here's what it all means. I mean, it's just, of course they would have this core structure and approach to sharing it right there where it happened. I mean, yeah.
And I remember that part of the book. Yeah, that was in Jesus Legend, and I took that observation from Robert Stein, who was one of my professors at Bethel Seminary back in the day, and from his book on the synoptic problem. And he pointed out that in doing so, telling the same story that many times, it would naturally take on what would seem to us as sort of a stylized way of talking, which some modern literary people can imagine as therefore fictionalized. Like, that doesn't sound like a real account. That sounds like something that is just stylized literarily. But wait a minute. Think about any important event in your life that you tell frequently, and you start I realize this. I find ways. It just comes out the same way after 20 years. Right. And it doesn't sound like it just happened yesterday. It sounds like I've said this before, because I have so many times. That's how oral communication works,
Right. And I actually have a few ways that I tell the same story, depending on what point I want to make.
Yes. How long you have and who you're talking to, right? Yeah.
And it's all true.
Exactly.
It's all true.
It gets the gist of it every time.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. So the final 2 points have to do then with the oral performers and the audience, and basically this claim. And here's another book that really, I think, was one of the more significant ones for me in writing the Jesus Legend, was John Niles' book, Homo Narrans. And it's kind of an anthropology of oral tradition. And he just points out in there, as does David Rubin in his book, really important book, Memory and Oral Tradition. And both of them point out that we know this from field work, but also just like being human, is that certain people in any community have better memories and are more interesting to listen to than other people. Right? Yeah. And you put that together.
To the chagrin of some of us pastors.
To the chagrin of everyone else. Try as we might,
Yes.
So Niles coins this phrase, the strong tradition bearer. And what he means by that is just people who were recognized by the rest of the community as having an inordinate gift to be one who bears the tradition or performs the tradition regularly because of, and he says, one, their pretty amazing retentive capacity. Their memories are really good, and they just can spin a yarn. They keep you interested. Everything probably from voice intonation to rhetorical flourishes and all the little variations that come out in an oral performance. But, in other words, the Boltmanian paradigm was wrong, that who's the main bearer of tradition is just kind of everybody.
Right.
No.
Right.
Yes, we all know the tradition, but we all recognize gifted performers who are specialized in the tradition. Yeah. And this starts putting a new light on, say, this is just ubiquitous through the New Testament, but the emphasis on teachers and on passing on tradition. Yeah. There you go. Those are the two components there that make sense out of strong tradition bearers in any oral context. And then finally, yes, although they're strong tradition bearers, the fourth piece is, but that doesn't render the community passive spectators in the performance arena. Right. Not at all. They are active. They are, in some sense, custodial. And this was done. This was a big piece of Ken Bailey's work in his 2 articles he published in the 90s, and Bailey being kind of one of the most well-known folks, I would say, defending an optimistic trajectory piece. He got critiqued pretty seriously by Theodore Whedon, and I think we need to take Whedon's critique seriously. Whedon wrote an article in response to Bailey's work. I won't get into all the details, but he shows some problems in some of Bailey's work. But Bailey himself admitted in the articles that he was not a field worker and not a trained anthropologist. He just noticed some stuff working as a missionary in Middle Eastern contemporary village life that seemed similar to how the Gospels worked in terms of their stability variation, and he just drew some parallels. I think we can appreciate things of Bailey's work that have been documented by other anthropologists in the field, and one of them is this, that, and again, Ruth Finnegan, really important person here for documenting this, as David Rubin was, that in oral contexts, communities, you can think of the performance not as a monologue to spectators, but as a dialogue. Yeah. That there's not just amening going on, which does happen, encouraging the performer, but Finnegan has an actual section in one of her articles where she records what she heard people saying in her African context when someone messed up the tradition. Yeah. And they would say things like, "You speak incorrectly," or "That didn't happen." Yeah. And this is all around things like religious and history things, not entertainment genres. Yeah, but this apparently shows that the oral community functioned as an active participant in performances and custodial force of the basic parameters. They had no problem with variations in the tradition, but if you went, quote unquote, outside the bounds of what was comfortable of the shared essence of the tradition, the audience knew it and said something about it. Yeah. And that's not something that comes out at all in this idea of, well, anyone felt comfortable creating something Jesus said if you needed it. That's not how oral cultures work.
Well, it's such a Western way to think about data, to think that that we're just telling history so that we can know what happened.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, instead of when someone gets up in my village or whatever, and they start telling the story, like, I've been hearing these stories since I was in the womb. I already know what happened, and I don't know this as like, oh, I took a test in school to make sure I knew my village history.
Yes.
But this is who we are. This is how I know how I relate with my mom and my dad, my grandparents, the chief, the priest. Like, this is who I. And so it's if you change the story, it's not just, oh, that's inaccurate data. That's not the bubble I bubbled in on my Scantron when I took my final exam. But that's not who we are.
That's not us. Yes.
Yes. It changes everything about what's communicated, why it's communicated, and how it's communicated. And so we look at Paul saying, hey, if any other gospel is communicated to you, then let that person be accursed. And we're like, oh, Paul was so prideful, like he just thought he had everything down, like we see that as like this Western attempt to try to control the narrative of the gospel. When it's like, no, like Paul was a Pharisee who held the coat for the first, for the people killing the first martyr. I mean, he knew who he was, and then he came face to face with the resurrected Messiah of his people, of his tradition. He saw Torah fulfilled face to face, and it changed who he was. He reanalyzed everything about what his tradition was, what it meant. And so he wasn't trying to control some for what? So he could be killed for his faith, Like he was passionate about who he was, who his Messiah was, and what Jesus was doing now, fulfilling the promises of Isaiah that the gospel is going out from Jerusalem, the Torah is going out from Jerusalem into all the world and drawing all nations to the like it's. It was a point of identity that he was sharing and crazily inviting people into.
Yes.
This is a super important point, I think, is why the text became so important for the New Testament community so much faster than it did for the Old Testament community.
Okay.
Is because this traditional material was launching outside of its context.
Yes, okay, yeah.
And so we needed something to hold on to of what talk about these strong tradition bearers, the apostles, who were carrying this eyewitness word from Jesus, the resurrected Jesus even. And so we needed the apostolic, these strong tradition bearers, we needed their authority on our identity.
You're right.
And so we get these texts now that bear that our church was planted. We recognized the apostolic performances. We recognize it in these texts. We believe these were written from the apostles, connected to the apostles, and so this text now is the performance of our tradition. And it's that happens in this not Western context, but this traditional context. And it's crazy. It's crazy that this tradition was overriding people's other traditional context, the stories that they had. And what's still happening today. Like, we have to have the traditions that we hold on to, our philosophies about life, about what's important, who we are. Like, the gospel overrides that, and it's so important and powerful when it does.
Oh, yes. It makes sense out of, Paul's injunction in 1 Corinthians and I think Thessalonians too, to test the prophecies, the traditions that you get. Against what? Right? Well, against what we know. And so you're right. And it suggests, I think, that our only problem isn't simply our highly literate presuppositions, which is a problem, big problem, but also you've used this word several times, our individualism.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. We don't resonate with this idea of that how I know who I am is by my community.
Right.
Personal individualistic identity in our world is largely a personal project. And I would say, as far as we know, right? The truth is our community still deeply shapes us. It's just it's below the conscious level. We have no idea how we're being shaped by every commercial that we see. We feel like we're doing this all on our own. The ancient world knew individuals only emerge from communities. That's how this works. And,
Paul Fittis made that shift in me. He wrote a book on the Trinity. I wish I could remember what it was. I think it was Paul S. Fiddes, Fiddes, I think.
Oh yeah, I remember the name. Yeah.
And he talked about that, about how what he said is, are you tall or are you short? How do you know? Like that is only discovered in community. Are you fast or are you slow? Are you smart? Are you super intelligent? Are you an introvert or extrovert? Like all of these parts about who we claim who we are, and we want to claim those things about ourselves.
Yes.
But all those things only have meaning in community. Like we cannot escape the fact that every part about our individual identity only has meaning in community.
Yes.
Because we're created by a God who is community,
Amen.
Yeah. That's great. Well, man. Well, let's see. Is there anything else about that you want to share? I don't want to.
No, I mean that really those are kind of, in my mind, those four observations from morality. At least, I think the way I end that essay is by saying these things should at least raise our consciousness as to the ways in which they would function to integratively to provide a serious stability factor to oral traditions, which generally is not, I think, is underappreciated by those who kind of operate out of the pessimistic trajectory. It's still a lot of room for conversation on nuances. But I think it again shifts us out of the modern individualistic mentality in a way with some cross-cultural data here of how this generally works. And it's sort of a burden of proof now on anyone in the pessimistic trajectory to say, well, it didn't work that way for the early Christians. You got the burden now to show that, because this seems to be how it does generally work for oral cultures.
Yeah, I almost wanted to, just as a fun mental practice, mental exercise, is I was going to think about asking you, like, we've talked about the kind of cultural reality that exists for the optimistic approach, right? That this is a part of their identity, that they all knew it. They already had this in their mind, so that they were able to correct. And so there was this traditional biosphere, this circumambient tradition that everybody had to even understand the performance. And so the fluidity had this stability that was connected to even have any kind of meaning in the first place, right? And so that we have this picture of this culture that would work to have a very, what you called in your article, I think, a conservative influence for preserving the core historical truths or whatever. Yeah. So as a mental practice, what would a culture look like? What would be the cultural realities to allow for a lack of stability? Do you know what I'm saying? Like what would the culture look like that is okay with novel invention as it goes? And where do we see that in field work today, or in the ancient world? I mean, could you do that if you tried to process what that would actually look like?
Well, honestly, the first thing that pops in my head when you say that is So what are the conditions of the possibility of that, of such a community, right?
Yes.
What would have to be the necessary conditions? And I think, I'd love to hear a counter to this, but I think a necessary condition would have to be what we're calling modern individualism. I don't, how else could that work?
Disconnected ideas about who you are and what's true.
Yes. See, if you really have a culture where you believe that where the concept of the individual is prioritized over the concept of the community, such that, this is just social contract theory of modern, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, that fundamentally communities are secondary and derivative of the need for individuals to get along together. We only need community to the extent that we need some kind of social cohesion and law system, so that I don't kill you and you don't kill me, and I don't steal your stuff and you don't steal, right? Like, to maximize our individual lives, we need community.
Right.
And that is so counterintuitive to most of human history. It's like, no, the community is the body. We're just individual cells that serve the community, and the community nourishes us, but it's much more symbiotic. And I don't know how you'd come up with the sort of pessimistic conclusions about outside of something like modern Western individualistic culture, where individuals find for themselves their identity, define for themselves what works and doesn't work, and only need community as sort of a secondary project to keep us from killing each other, basically.
Right.
And lo and behold, that is the culture that produced this idea. So,
Right. Yeah. It's hard to imagine what it would look like for a community to gather around and say, hey, this tradition about the Exodus, that was one culture. Now we're in this land, where there was people came in and conquered this land. Let's just connect our cultures together and say this all happened to us. And everybody's saying, yes, that's who we are. Like what kind of naive, identityless people are we trying to conjure up in our heads that will just adopt a known fabrication as their identity?
Yeah. It's interesting because, in a way, the difficulty with which we modern individualistic post-Gutenberg people have of really conceptualizing and feeling, imaginatively experiencing the power of that the dynamics of an oral culture. It struck me, as I've thought about this over the years, that it's somewhat similar to the difficulty of we modern Western individualistic people imagining how in the world banishment and exile could be a functional threat to people in the ancient world, such that the very fear of banishment prevented people from doing crazy things in their culture. For me, if the punishment for doing heinous crimes in Minnesota was you shall be banished to Texas and never come back, it's like, if it's winter, I might just do something to get banished to Texas.
Yeah, right.
Because I'll set up shop in Texas.
Right.
Paul Eddy, the individual, carries his identity apart from community wherever he goes, right?
Yeah.
And,
I'll go be me wherever I am.
Yeah. There was this movie, I don't know how well known it was. One of Johnny Depp's movies in the 90s is a Western. And this really impactful moment for me when he's traveling through the woods, he's on the run, and he meets this Native American, and they kind of partner up and start riding together. He finally asks this guy, "What's your name?" And the Native American says, "Oh, my name is Nobody." He goes, "Well, that's a weird name." He said, "How'd you get that name?" Why'd your parents get... He said, "Oh, no, my parents didn't give me that name. I used to have a name. But then my tribe banished me. And ever since I left that day, I've been nobody."
Wow.
That is the power of community in the ancient world for identity formation.
Yeah.
We don't get that.
Right.
I'm Paul Eddy whenever and wherever I
Right.
go, you know.
So where in that committee does somebody even have idea, I'm going to tell a news story about who we are? You know, like what?
Here's one, folks. We're this instead of that. Like, what?
And everybody says, oh, I like that.
Yeah,
Let's
I
do
like that one better. Yeah.
It's so funny. It's so funny. Yeah. So you said that you've haven't been able to focus on. You've been focusing on other areas of study lately.
Yeah.
But I know this still reverberates in how you approach the Bible. So can you just describe it as a pastor? It's so fun to talk to a pastor who's like a amazing scholar and an amazing pastor. Like how does this approach impact your pastoral work?
Yeah. Well, I guess I'd start by saying that, you know, my two wings of my vocational life, kind of scholarship and teaching in academic setting at Bethel, and then pastoring at Woodland Hills. I think there's sort of a shared core out of which I'd answer that, particularly for the pastoral side or the other. And that shared core is that it seems to me, whether it's a person teaching scripture and theology at a university or a pastor interfacing with the congregation in the various ways we do in terms of teaching, that the shared core is we care about scripture and we want people to be versatile and effective readers, digesters, and embodiers of this narrative. And so, you know, in academic context, would say good exegesis is really important. And I now deeply believe that good exegesis is impossible without a sensibility of orality. Right back to, you know, Boomerschein's media eisegesis, that we don't even know we're doing unless we have this basic understanding. So I think that both on academic and pastoral side, that sort of, how do we exegete orality? How do we do that well when we're in the context of either academic or pastoral work? More particularly for my pastoral life, my primary responsibilities at my church are, I'm a part-time pastor. My full-time vocation is Bethel, but most of what I do there is teaching in smaller contexts. So adult education courses. We also have an in-house non-accredited seminary. And so those are my two places I do most of my teaching for my congregation. I'd say the third kind of stream I get involved in is I'm kind of the theological resource pastor at our church. So any email we get asking questions about the Bible or theology, I tend to be the one who responds. So in those three areas, I think that where I find orality coming into my teaching or my responses to emails is sort of three areas. Any questions about Scripture, I can't help it now but ask the question, and does the orality factor come into my response? And sometimes it doesn't, but more often I find myself thinking about something there, and it shapes, if not explicitly, at least implicitly, how I think about answering like Bible or exegetical questions. There's also, and this was what motivated originally the Jesus Legend project, is just apologetics questions. Right. You know, we at Woodland Hills Church consider ourselves part of the neo-Anabaptist kind of resurgence these days. And as an Anabaptistly oriented church, one of the main claims or commitments of Anabaptism is we want to seriously put Jesus at the center of all things. That means, in some ways, recentering the Gospels. And I think in some traditions of the church, Paul's got more attention than Jesus has. And so all of a sudden the Gospels become of real practical significance to Anabaptism.
Yeah.
And so the question of, can we trust the Gospels is particularly meaningful, I think, for Anabaptists. And so that apologetic dimension, I continue to draw on my work that we're talking about here as I teach the Gospels, as I teach my Life and Teachings of Jesus course at Woodland Hills. I can't not have a section on orality now. It's always there. And I think then, given that our church emerged out of the broadly evangelical world, as we talked about, there's sort of challenges for each side, right? I find that there's challenges I bring to some of my more conservative congregation members to help them imagine an ancient world where they as modern literate people, their standards and expectations of reliability wouldn't be shared by Paul, by Jesus. And that's actually, when they kind of get past and really understand what I'm saying about orality and that, I found it actually helps them to, in a sense, lighten up on some of the very particulars, right?
Yes.
And appreciate what actually undergirds all this that they never even thought about. Right. So I'd say those are kind of three main ways that this really impacts pastoral life for me. Yeah, very practically.
That's so good. Paul, one of my deep desires is that this conversation can also help us as denominations, congregations, realize how much of the core we actually share.
Yes.
And the things that we fight about sometimes did not matter to the early church. Predestination or free will, so many things. So many things. I won't list them because I don't want to make anybody mad.
You're singing my song, brother.
Yeah.
A lot of my other academic work outside of this field has been six books with co-edited by my friend Jim Beilby, taking different theological debates today. And so open theism, justification, atonement, all these things that divide sisters and brothers in Christ. And using these books to show that Jesus-loving, Bible-believing, intelligent Christians can come to very different conclusions on what I would call doctrinal and opinion level matters, while all indisputably holding the dogma Jesus-center core to our faith. And we let this peripheral stuff have much more say-so in our lives than the actual core that we all say, well, yeah, of course that. Well, that, that's the gospel, and
we're one in that.
Yes,
absolutely.
One. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So,
Did you ever read Dorothy Sayers' stuff?
No, not much of it.
Yeah, Dorothy Sayers, she was like a pen pal of C.S. Lewis.
Oh, was she? Okay.
Yeah, she wrote detective plays. I think that was her main shtick or whatever. She has a translation of the Divine Comedy. I think she was only able to do the first book of that, which is Hell or Purgatory, or Hell or whatever. But when she translated it, she kept the meter, which I don't remember what it's called, but it's like the first. There's 3 lines. The first and third line rhyme, and then the middle line rhymes with the first and third line of the next deal. When in her translation, she kept that flow, and then she has like notes. It's like a study Bible for the Divine Comedy, and so. But she also wrote some on Christian thought and stuff. And she's brilliant. She's brilliant. Clear why she would be a pen pal of Lewis, but she has this one article. I think it's called "The Dogma is the Drama." But her what she says is basically like the word dogma gets a bad rap these days, like it's just dry doctrinal, stuff. She says, but no, like when we talk about God, that Jesus was both God and man, like that's the drama of the story. And I think that the name of the article is called "The greatest drama ever staged.
Okay.
It's
but
fantastic.
But she gets into dogma in there.
Yeah, and she just talks about how when we see Jesus on the cross, it's the dogma that breathes all of the drama in the story. So there's a debate, well, what matters more, story and narrative or like dry truth?
Yes.
Well, sometimes that's a false dichotomy. Like the dogma that Jesus was both God and man, that is the drama of the story. And it's just so beautifully told.
Huh.
It's worth a Google. I think it's all
absolutely.
online. Yeah, the greatest drama ever staged.
Yeah, because when I use these categories, we use this so much at our church, that we just call our Jesus dogma doctrine opinion model, and show that so much of the debate is over here. But we love Jesus, we want to follow him, and the dogma, to your point, that's not the dry doctrinal debates. I often just say that's what Lewis meant by mere Christianity. And it's also, interestingly, kind of the flow of the meta-narrative of Scripture, right? Like it's narrativized. Right. We can like abstract pieces out and talk doctrinally about them, but they really live and breathe in the drama. I love that, the meta-narrative. So I'll have to look at that. Yeah,
so good. That's maybe last question.
Yeah.
It'd be really fun to hear how you articulate this. What does the Bible mean to you in the context of your relationship with Jesus? Because the Bible, we've kind of redefined what the Bible is.
Yeah.
It's not the verbal, plenary, inspirational definition of the Bible. It's not Gunkel or Bultmann's Bible. It's not, But so what does the Bible mean to you in the context of your relationship with Jesus?
You're getting personal here, brother. Good for you.
Well, this stuff's got to matter, right?
Oh, it does. Absolutely.
It's got to matter. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's a great question. I think two things come to mind, kind of forefront on that question. How my rally studies impacted my answer to that question? I would say, I don't think I'd be the only evangelical scholar who said growing up in the evangelical church left me with a distinct sense that whenever we use the phrase Word of God, we're clearly talking about the Bible, written in its canonical form that I can pick up in whatever English translation I want. And my one of the things orality studies has done is help me realize, first, that I don't think the early church would have heard the Word of God, I don't think they would have first and foremost thought of the Bible, since it hadn't even been collected yet. At least not the New Testament. But I think they would have thought of Jesus, like John chapter 1 Word of God, right? The living Word. And that this whole thing has helped me think about what an early Christian would have thought in terms of Word of God. Jesus comes first. Probably spoken word comes next, because that's what's happening. And out of all of that, out of the lordship of the living Word, who lived a life that was now inspiring a spoken word tradition in this community, that eventuates, once you start losing apostolic witnesses, you start needing something to anchor it again, and now written word emerges. So all of that's to say, I guess I look back now on my evangelical upbringing and wonder if, with all well intention behind it, I wasn't led to sort of a form of bibliolatry in some sense.
Yeah.
Even putting the Bible as the Word of God over Jesus as it's weird, right? Because
the goal was to know the Bible really well and obey it.
Yes.
Not to have a
real. We use the word personal relationship a lot, but when it said, well, how do you do that? read the, it was very text centric.
Yeah.
Maybe more so than living Jesus centric sometimes. So that's really been a reframe for me. However, at the same time, because one could take that and say, oh, so Paul, the Bible's become less important for Paul. I don't want to say that. I want to say maybe the living word, Jesus, and the spoken word, understanding that role it had, have become more important than they used to be. I don't want to say the Bible's been demoted, but I see it in context now of other dimensions of how the Word of God comes to us.
Yeah.
But I want to say it doesn't demote the Bible for me, because I don't think anything I've said there or anything I've learned in orality studies prevents me from also holding a deep conviction of the inspiration of the Bible. I don't see an inherent dichotomy here at all. However, what it does do, this whole orality piece has unavoidably complexified and communalized my understanding of inspiration, of what must have been the case in those centuries leading up to the collection of the canon, for God, for the living Word, through the Spirit of the living Word, inspiring the community, including certain strong tradition bearers, to carry faithfully an oral proclamation through a millennia or more, which of a dominantly oral culture up until Gutenberg. And see, that often doesn't get appreciation in my evangelical contemporary world of what the Spirit's concern was for the faithfulness of the oral tradition when most people are illiterate for most of Christian history. Right. And that all is part of the process of now gospel authors and Paul having moments where they freeze a performance for us, for which I'm thankful. But it's much more complex and more communal than this sort of frozen moment of kind of de novo scripture coming out of nowhere. It's like,
right,
doesn't seem true to the communal nature of early Christianity, and how even the authors themselves would have been thinking about what they're doing as they're putting pen to paper. So all of that from morality has reframed my appreciation for Scripture, how it came to be, and how I can imagine and make use of Scripture in my life, back to connecting me to the things we were just talking about, to the drama, to the narrative, to how could I, in a modern world, be something like an ancient Christian for whom the tradition of Jesus is the gestalt out of which everything else matters. How I live my life, how I read the written text, how I treat my sisters and brothers, all of that. So
I couldn't help but think of, Acts chapter 2, like when the church was birthed, right? Yeah. And they devoted themselves to to koinonia and the apostles' teaching.
Yes. Yes.
And the koinonia is broken down into the breaking of bread and the prayers.
Bread, house to house. Yeah. So in each other's homes.
Yeah, but like, and that there were the apostles' teachings, which was, we might say that's the Bible now for us, right? But it was this like communal word.
Yes.
And when they heard it, it changed their identity to the extent that they're just having all things in common. They're meeting daily in the temple. It is, to hear it as this oral, traditional, this word of God written on the hearts of the community. And when it's written on the hearts of the community is different than it was. Yeah. Oh, I love it.
Yeah.
Well, Paul, we're pushing right up against 12 o'clock here. I cannot thank you enough. I just, I wish we could do this every day. At least once a week. But
absolutely.
And I just so appreciate. I appreciate who you are, and I'm really, really grateful for you. Is there anything that I know you're not, really big on Instagram or anything like that? But is there anything that you want to push people to? I mean, I know you've got a book you're working on. Is there anything that you want to promote or anything like that?
No, wow. Yeah. So these days, the last number of years, my interests, and actually this is coming out of pastoral interests, was just questions that were being raised in my congregational context around sexuality today. And 2011, 12, 13, those began to increase to the point that my academic interests shift to kind of trying to hopefully help the church begin to wrestle with some of these things in a humble, informed sort of way. I'm one of the things I've begun to do since stepping into that world, as I'm a research associate at the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender, and probably most people aren't going to be interested in this, but I've done some pretty deep dives into some of the more dicey issues around transgender experience and identity, and they're posted there on the center's website on the academic section. Currently working on kind of my big book on sexuality. It's going to be called The Significance of Sex, a Covenantal Theology of Human Sexuality. So much going on there, so many questions that I think the church has neglected. I'd love to see the church at the forefront of this cultural conversation, modeling humility and dialogue and all of that, and instead we're often kind of bringing up the rear, not always in the most helpful ways. So that's my hope, as the church begins to turn a corner on helping our culture have winsome and Jesus-centric, informed, like bringing something to the conversation that is distinctly from the Church of Jesus that I think can be helpful. So those are some of my passions these days.
Yeah, awesome. What's the website for that? The Center of Faith and Sexuality. Do you know the website offhand? I can post it in the description.
Yeah, I don't offhand. Something about center or faith.
Yeah, I'll post. I'll tell you what. Listen, when I get really rich off of this one book that I've written, when I get really rich, I'm going to hire you an assistant, a PR assistant, because your work is so phenomenal. Like we need to launch it out there. We need to, but you're just not a promotional kind of guy.
So I've shown you this, but this is my flip phone, and I will not give it up. It's not connected to the internet. I don't know, man. I'm an old dog, and give me books and articles, man. Books and articles.
Yes, yeah. Well, Paul, I sure appreciate you. You're a gift. You're a gift to the church, and so grateful for you, man.
Well, so man, it goes both ways. If one of the many blessings of the Jesus legend, trust me, it wasn't big royalties over the years, but one of them was we got to meet through that book, and our friendship developed, and it's been wonderful traveling this little journey together, and having a chance to finally meet you and Becca in December. Actually, it was January 1st. It was New Year's Day.
Oh, that's right. That's
and
right.
We had breakfast together, and so thankful for our friendship. Thankful for this opportunity to be on the podcast, and really for what you're doing to help make this really important work accessible to the church. And so thank you for that.
Yeah. Thanks, man. All right. We'll talk to you again soon.
All right. God bless.
All right. I'm not actually going to hang up on you.